Engines whining like dying mosquitoes echoed across the valley floor, a pitiful sound compared to what was coming. 50 tons of prime winter wheat sat stranded at the bottom of Ridgeback Pass, a haul that would make or break the Higgins family farm by midnight. Every shiny, chrome-dipped lease operator had taken one look at the grade and backed out, tossing their keys and spitting insults at a rusted-out 1,995 Kenworth parked in the corner of the gravel lot. Scrap metal, they called it, a rolling coffin. They didn't know about the ghost sleeping under that faded fiberglass hood. They didn't know about the N14. Jolene Higgins leaned against the sun-baked, oxidized blue fender of her 1,995 Kenworth W900, a half-drilled mug of lukewarm black coffee in her calloused hands. The air at Miller's Agricultural Co-op was thick with the smell of unburnt diesel, hot asphalt, and the palpable arrogance of debt-financed fiberglass. It was mid-July, the kind of brutal, unforgiving summer that baked the topsoil into talcum powder and made the horizon shimmer with heat waves. Around her, the co-op parking lot looked more like a showroom for a corporate logistics firm than a gathering of independent farmers. Sleek, aerodynamic Peterbilt 579S and Freightliner Cascadias hummed with quiet, computerized efficiency. Their drivers, men who looked more like accountants in high-vis vests than gear jammers, huddled in the shade of the way station awnings. They were the new breed. They drove automatics, relied on lane assist, and panicked if their dash screens flashed a warning code they couldn't instantly Google. And then there was Jolene. And there was Old Blue. To the untrained eye, the W900 was a heartbreaking relic. The paint, once a vibrant cobalt, had surrendered to decades of relentless UV exposure, fading to the chalky, mottled complexion of a bruised plum. The aluminum wheels were dull. The stainless steel bumper bore the scars of 100 rogue deer and unseen snowbanks. And the sleeper cab looked like a metal shoebox bolted to the frame. The truck looked exactly like what it was, a 30-year-old farm implement that had spent its entire life dragging 80,000 pounds of grain, timber, and cattle through the worst terrain the Pacific Northwest had to offer. "Hey, Jolene, call the scrapyard yet?" The voice belonged to Blake Masterson. Blake was a third-generation trust fund farmer who had recently sold out half his family's acreage to buy a fleet of 2024 Peterbilt 389S. He sauntered over, flanked by his lackeys, Kurt Willis and Chad Donahue. Blake was wearing designer aviators and a pair of boots that had never seen a day of actual mud. Jolene didn't flinch. She took a slow sip of her coffee. "Mornin', Blake. Trucks are looking shiny. Pity they can't pull their own weight in a stiff breeze." Blake chuckled, a hollow, grating sound. He slapped the weathered fender of Old Blue, leaving a handprint in the thin layer of agricultural dust. "This thing is a liability, Joe. Seriously. Look at it. I'm surprised the DOT hasn't impounded it just for sitting here. You're leaking oil on Miller's good gravel." "She's marking her territory," Jolene said flatly. "And it's a slobber tube, Blake. It breathes. Something your computerized plastic toys wouldn't understand." Kurt Willis snorted, crossing his arms. "Breathes? Sounds like it's got asthma. My new Freightliner has 500 horsepower and a 12-speed auto. I can pull the Eisenhower pass while sipping a latte and watching a movie. That dinosaur you got there, I bet you need a tetanus shot just to turn the key." "It's about torque, Kurt, not just what the brochure told you at the dealership," Jolene replied, her voice dropping an octave, carrying the weary weight of a woman who had fought this battle 100 times. "You rely on microchips to tell your engine when to shift. I rely on my right arm and my ears." The truth was, the Higgins farm was drowning. Jolene's father, Roy Higgins, had passed away 2 years prior from a sudden heart attack right in the driver's seat of this very truck. He had managed to safely pull over, set the maxi brakes, and pass from this world with the engine still idling. Since then, Jolene had taken the reins, fighting a losing battle against plummeting crop prices, skyrocketing fertilizer costs, and a massive balloon payment on their land due to a predatory agricultural bank. The shiny new corporate outfits like Blake's were just waiting for her to default, so they could swallow her land for pennies on the dollar. Old Blue was all she had left of her father, and it was the only piece of equipment on the farm that was fully paid for. The local mechanics laughed at it, the New Age truckers mocked it. But what none of them knew, what Jolene kept entirely to herself, was what lay beneath the faded fiberglass hood. 3 years ago, right before the financial walls started closing in, Roy had pulled the tired old cat engine out of the W900. In its place, he and Jolene had dropped in a legend, a Cummins N14. But not just any N14. They had sourced a Select Plus red top, arguably the greatest heavy-duty diesel engine ever cast in iron. They had spent an entire winter rebuilding it in their drafty barn. They bored it out, installed marine-grade injectors, a massive, custom-machined Borg-Warner twin-turbo setup, and a Pittsburgh power box. They straight-piped it with 8-inch stacks. On paper, Blake's truck made 500 horsepower. In reality, Old Blue's heavily modified N14 was pushing well over 800 horsepower and nearly 3,000 foot-pounds of torque to the rear wheels. It was a sleeper in the truest sense of the word, a mechanical monster wearing the ragged clothes of a beggar. "Look, Joe," Blake said, feigning sympathy. "The co-op has a massive contract moving the overflow grain to the railhead tomorrow. It's a heavy haul, 55 tons a load. I'm taking 3 of my trucks. Just stay out of the way, all right? I don't want you breaking an axle on the scales and holding up production. We have real work to do." Jolene just stared at him, her green eyes hard as polished jade. "We'll see who's holding up who, Blake." The crisis didn't wait for tomorrow. It hit at 4 p.m. that afternoon, rolling in with the black, bruised clouds of a freak summer squall. The emergency klaxon above the Miller Co-op office began to wail, cutting through the heavy, humid air. Men scrambled out of their air-conditioned cabs, gathering around the loading docks where a frantic-looking dispatcher named Dale was waving a clipboard like a white flag. "Listen up," Dale shouted over the rising wind. "We got a massive situation. Interstate 84 is closed. Mudslide just took out a quarter-mile of asphalt near the canyon." A collective groan went up from the assembled drivers. I-84 was the only paved artery to the main railhead. "It gets worse," Dale barked, his face pale. "The county dam's bypass valve just failed. The reservoir is cresting. If they don't get the replacement industrial transformer up there to power the emergency spillway gates by nightfall, the dam is going to overtop. If that happens, the lower valley floods. Every single one of our lower silos will be underwater. Millions of dollars in grain. Bankruptcies for everyone." The crowd went dead silent. The wind whipped dust across the gravel, stinging their faces. "The state sent the transformer down via rail to our siding here," Dale continued, pointing to a massive, tarp-covered behemoth sitting on a specialized multi-axle lowboy trailer at the edge of the lot. "It weighs 110,000 pounds. Combined with the trailer, we are looking at a gross weight of over 150,000 pounds. The only way to the dam now is up Ridgeback Pass." Ridgeback Pass wasn't a road. It was a glorified logging trail carved into the side of the mountain by madmen in the 1960s. It was 12 miles of punishing, 17% grades, blind switchbacks, and loose gravel. To make matters worse, the incoming rain was about to turn that gravel into deep, slick mud. "The state boys don't have a rig here capable of pulling it. They need an independent contractor. Right now, they are offering $30,000 to whoever can hook up to that lowboy and drag it to the summit," Dale said. $30,000. Jolene's heart hammered against her ribs. That was the exact amount of the balloon payment due on the farm by the end of the month. It was a lifeline thrown from the heavens. But before she could step forward, Blake Masterson pushed his way to the front, grinning like a shark. 30 grand? I'll take it. My new 389 has the power. Kurt, Chad, get the pilot cars ready." Dale looked doubtful. "Blake, that's an extreme haul. Your trucks are geared for highway cruising, not heavy vocational mountain pulling. It's a 500 horsepower pack car engine, Dale. It'll walk up that hill," Blake sneered, already signaling to his lead driver. "Hook my flagship rig up to the lowboy." For the next 30 minutes, the co-op was a flurry of activity as Blake's pristine, chrome-laden Peterbilt was backed up to the massive lowboy. The transformer loomed over the cab, a terrifying monolith of iron and copper. By the time they dropped the kingpin into the fifth wheel, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, hitting the hot dust like bullets. The entire co-op gathered at the base of Ridgeback Pass, a mile up the road, to watch. Jolene parked Old Blue off to the shoulder, standing on her running board to get a view. Blake's Peterbilt sat at the bottom of the grade, the massive trailer behind it looking like an anchor. The rain was steady now, slicking the red clay and gravel. "Watch and learn, Higgins," Kurt Willis yelled from the window of his pilot truck, giving Jolene a mock salute. Blake hit the air horn, a computerized, high-pitched blast, and put the automatic transmission into drive. He mashed the throttle. The Peterbilt roared, black smoke puffing politely from its dual stacks. The massive truck surged forward and immediately shuddered. The automated manual transmission, confused by the immense dead weight on a steep incline combined with the lack of traction, tried to upshift to second gear. It was a fatal, computerized error. The RPMs dropped, the engine lugged dangerously, and the computer panicked, desperately trying to downshift back to first. Bang! A sound like a cannon shot echoed off the mountain walls. Blake's truck violently jerked and came to a dead halt. The drive tires spun helplessly in the mud, whining in protest. Blake leaned out the window, his face purple with rage. The transmission slipped. The traction control is cutting my throttle. He tried again. He revved the engine and popped the clutch equivalent. The truck moved 2 feet. The tires dug deep, slick trenches in the wet clay. The heavy trailer started to slide backward, pulling the rear of the Peterbilt sideways. "Brake! Brake!" Dale screamed over the radio. Blake slammed on his brakes, the entire combination sliding backward, another 3 feet before terrifyingly coming to rest inches from the soft shoulder drop-off. He was stuck. The great, computerized flagship of his fleet had been defeated by the first 50 yards of a 12-mile climb. The crowd of drivers stared in stunned silence. The rain was pouring now, turning the valley into a gloomy, grey bowl. The dam was hours away from failing. The $30,000 bounty was slipping away. "Get a heavy wrecker up here to pull him out," Dale muttered, burying his face in his hands. "It's over. Nobody else has the rig for this." "Excuse me." The voice was calm, steady, and cut through the sound of the driving rain. The crowd parted. Jolene Higgins walked through the mud, her battered Carhartt jacket soaked, her boots caked in clay. She walked right past Blake, who was currently kicking the front tire of his stuck Peterbilt and cursing at his dashboard tablet. Jolene stopped in front of Dale. "Get his plastic toy out of the way. I'll take the load." A stunned silence fell over the gathered crowd, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain on a dozen aluminum trailers. Then, someone laughed. It was Chad Donahue, standing under an umbrella by his pickup. "You?" Chad snorted. "You're going to pull 150,000 pounds up a 17% grade in the mud with that piece of junk? Joe, sweetheart, that rust bucket couldn't pull a greasy string out of a dog's behind right now." Blake, having marched through the mud away from his stranded truck, joined in, his humiliation instantly morphing into venom. "Are you insane, Higgins? Did you hit your head? My rig is brand new and it couldn't get traction. Your truck has 1,000,000 miles on it. You'll snap your drive shaft in 2 and kill yourself, and then the bank will just take your farm tomorrow anyway." Jolene didn't look at Blake. She kept her eyes locked on Dale, the dispatcher. "Dale, the bounty is 30 grand. Open contract. My truck is fully insured, heavy haul certified, and I have the endorsements. Get the wrecker to yank him out. I'm backing under that lowboy." Dale looked from Jolene to the rusted, faded blue W900 sitting quietly in the distance. He swallowed hard. "Joe, he's right. That's a suicide haul for a standard rig, let alone one that old. I can't let you risk it." "You don't have a choice, Dale." Jolene raised her voice, the fire finally breaking through her calm exterior. "If that dam breaks, my farm is gone. Your job is gone. The co-op is gone. It's me, or it's a flood. Now make the call." Something in her eyes, the desperate, iron-willed legacy of Roy Higgins, convinced him. Dale grabbed his radio. "Dispatch wrecker to the base of Ridgeback. Tell them to drag Masterson's truck clear. Higgins is up." The next 20 minutes were agonizing. The heavy wrecker arrived, hooked onto Blake's humiliated Peterbilt, and unceremoniously dragged it sideways off the lowboy and into the ditch to clear the path. Jolene walked back to Old Blue. The rain was coming down in sheets now. The drivers didn't leave. They huddled together under the way station canopy, a chorus of murmurs, wagers, and cruel jokes passing among them. They were waiting for a spectacle. They were waiting for the final, catastrophic failure of the Higgins family. Jolene grabbed the stainless steel handle of her driver's door. The metal was cold. She swung the heavy door open and climbed into the cab. Inside, it didn't smell like new plastic and leather cleaner. It smelled like decades of honest work, old coffee, worn denim, and the faint, permanent aroma of diesel oil. The dashboard wasn't a sleek digital screen. It was a sprawling aircraft-style cockpit of analog gauges, toggle switches, and a massive 18-speed Eaton Fuller manual transmission stick towering from the floorboards. She settled into the worn air ride seat, her hands gripping the large, hard plastic steering wheel. She closed her eyes for just a second. "All right, Dad. Let's show these corporate boys what real iron can do." She reached forward and turned the ignition key halfway. A series of loud, mechanical clicks echoed in the cab as the heavy-duty solenoids engaged. The battery voltage gauge snapped to attention. No screens booted up, no soft chimes played, just the raw flow of electricity arming a mechanical beast. Outside, Blake and his crew stood with their arms crossed. "Watch," Blake told Kurt. "The starter is probably going to just click and die. If it even turns over, she'll blow a head gasket the second she puts it in gear." Jolene pushed the heavy clutch pedal all the way to the floorboards. It took real leg strength, not like the soft pedals of the new trucks. She grabbed the key, took a deep breath, and twisted it hard. The massive starter motor engaged with a violent, metallic clack. For 3 agonizing seconds, the heavy iron internals of the engine fought the compression. The crowd snickered. Then, the marine-grade injectors fired. A massive dose of diesel was blasted into the cylinders under immense pressure. The block ignited. Kaboom, thut thut thut. The 1995 Kenworth violently rocked to the right, the entire chassis twisting under the sudden, explosive torque of the ignition. A massive plume of thick, coal-black smoke erupted from the 8-inch straight pipes, shooting 20 feet into the rainy sky like a volcano erupting. The crowd physically took a step back. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate. This wasn't the polite, muffled hum of a modern emissions-choked pack car engine. This was a raw, unadulterated, mechanical roar. The idle was deep, resonant, and aggressive, a rhythmic, guttural thumping that sounded like a massive iron heart beating in the chest of a giant. But it wasn't just the rumble that silenced the crowd. It was the other sound. As Jolene feathered the throttle to warm the cylinders, the massive, custom Borg-Warner twin turbos began to spool. Even at low RPMs, they sucked in air with a terrifying high-pitched scream. It was a piercing banshee wail that cut cleanly through the sound of the rain and the thunder. It was the unmistakable, terrifying whistle of a heavily tuned Cummins N14. Kurt Willis's jaw literally dropped. He looked at Blake, the color draining from his face. Blake, that ain't no stock motor. What is that sound? Chad yelled over the noise, covering his ears as the high-pitched whistle echoed off the canyon walls. That's a red top. An older, grizzled trucker in the back of the crowd whispered in awe. She's got a ghost in that machine. Jolene watched her analog gauges sweep. Oil pressure, perfect. Air pressure, building rapidly to 120 pounds per square inches. Water temperature rising. The engine was cold-blooded and hungry. She reached up and slammed the tractor parking brake valve in. PSSSHH. She shifted the 18 speed into reverse. She didn't use the clutch to slide it in. She knew the gearbox by feel. She backed the massive, rusted truck toward the stranded lowboy with the precision of a surgeon. The W900 didn't stutter, didn't lug. It crawled backward like a stalking predator, the turbo whistle rising and falling with millimeter-precise movements of her right foot. Clang! The kingpin slammed into the fifth wheel, the locking jaws snapping shut with brutal finality. Jolene jumped out, hooked up her red and blue airlines to the trailer, and cranked up the landing gear. The rain soaked her, but she didn't care. The adrenaline was pure liquid fire in her veins. She climbed back into the cab. This was it, 150,000 pounds, deep mud, a 17% grade. She engaged the power divider, locking all 4 rear wheels together for maximum traction. She flipped the toggle switch for the engine fan, ensuring it ran continuously to keep the massive beast cool under the impending strain. She grabbed the CB radio mic. Dale, Co-op. This is Old Blue. We are locked, loaded, and rolling out. She dropped the transmission into low. First gear. The crawler gear. Jolene eased off the clutch and simultaneously pressed her boot into the throttle. The N14 didn't just rev it. It exploded into action. The deep, guttural thumping transformed into a deafening, earth-shaking roar. A solid pillar of black diesel smoke shot from the stacks, turning the grey rain into ink. And then came the whistle. As the turbos fully spooled, packing over 40 pounds of boost into the intake manifold, the W900 shrieked. It was a sound that shook the fillings in the teeth of the men standing 50 yards away. The entire W900 squatted down, the massive torque twisting the rear axles so hard the leaf springs groaned in agony. The 8 drive tires, deep-treaded virgin rubber that Jolene had sacrificed groceries to buy months ago, bit violently into the mud. They didn't spin aimlessly like the Peterbilts had. They dug in, searching for bedrock, throwing massive roosters of wet clay 40 feet into the air. Slowly, impossibly, the 150,000-pound combination began to move. Blake Masterson watched in absolute horror the rusted, chalky blue Kenworth. The truck he had mocked for years, the truck he had declared dead, was pulling a load his multi-million-dollar fleet couldn't budge. Jolene's eyes were locked on the steep grade ahead. The tachometer needle hovered at 1,800 revolutions per minute. The W900 was moving at barely 3 miles an hour. But it was moving. The chassis creaked, the frame rails flexed. But the N14 just kept roaring, answering every pound of resistance with 1,000 foot-pounds of violent, unapologetic torque. She hit the base of the grade. The real test had begun. Inside the cab of the 1995 Kenworth W900, the noise was absolute. There was no sound dampening, no plush acoustic paneling to isolate the driver from the brutal reality of internal combustion. The custom Borg-Warner twin-turbo screamed with a deafening, high-pitched whistle that vibrated deep in Jolene Higgins's molars. Beneath that shriek was the guttural, rhythmic sledgehammer pounding of the Cummins N14 engine, converting raw diesel into pure, violent forward motion. The pyrometer, a gauge measuring the exhaust gas temperatures, was already climbing past 900 degrees. The needle on the manifold pressure gauge was pinned at 42 pounds of boost. Jolene's right hand rested lightly but firmly on the heavy, polished wooden knob of the 18-speed Eaton Fuller shifter. Her left hand gripped the steering wheel, fighting the deep ruts that the torrential rain was carving into the gravel of Ridgeback Pass. At a gross combined weight of 150,000 pounds, every incline felt like driving straight into a concrete wall. The W900 was crawling at an agonizing 4 miles per hour in deep reduction gear. Behind her, the massive, multi-axle lowboy trailer groaned, the steel frame flexing under the colossal weight of the industrial transformer. "Old Blue, this is Pilot Car 1. You copy?" The CB radio cracked to life, fighting through the static of the electrical storm overhead. It was Bo Dawson, an old friend of Jolene's father who ran a battered Ford F-350 with a flashing yellow light bar. Bo was following 50 yards behind the trailer, watching the axles. Jolene grabbed the mic, keeping her eyes glued to the switchback approaching through the rain-lashed windshield. "I copy, Bo. How are the trailer tandems tracking?" "They're digging deep, Joe." Bo's voice was tight with tension. "The mud is turning to slick clay. You're leaving trenches back here a foot deep. The grade jumps to 15% around this next bend. You gotta keep your momentum. If you stop, you're never getting started again." "I know," Jolene muttered, clipping the mic back to the dash. She knew the physics of it. If she lost traction and came to a halt on a grade this steep, the sheer dead weight of the transformer would overcome the parking brakes. The entire rig would slide backward, jackknife, and tumble off the edge of the mountain into the canyon below. As she approached the bend, the RPMs began to drop. The N14 was lugging, the heavy iron internals fighting against the relentless pull of gravity. The engine note deepened, transforming into a booming, strained roar. "1500 RPM, 1500 RPM, 1500 RPM. If it dropped below 1,000, she would stall. Jolene had to split a gear. It was the most dangerous maneuver on a steep incline. Modern automatic trucks did this seamlessly with computer-controlled dual clutches. In a vintage W900, it required floating the gears matching the engine RPM perfectly to the transmission speed without using the clutch pedal, all in a fraction of a second. Miss the shift, and the transmission would fall into neutral. On a 15% grade, falling into neutral meant immediate, catastrophic backward acceleration. She took a deep breath. She backed off the throttle for a millisecond, feeling the torque release on the driveline. In that split second, she slapped the splitter switch on the side of the shifter knob backward and yanked the stick out of gear. The engine roared freely for a heartbeat. Jolene tapped the throttle, blipping the RPMs up to 1,600, and shoved the heavy stick forward into the next lower ratio. Clunk. The heavy steel gears of the Eaton Fuller meshed perfectly. The W900 shuddered, the tires bit hard, and the Cummins grabbed the lower gear with a triumphant, howling surge of power. The thick black smoke pouring from the 8-inch stacks turned into a steady grey stream of pure exertion. "Beautiful shift, kid," Bo's voice crackled over the radio. "Sounded like your dad was driving." Jolene didn't smile. Her arms were already aching. The power steering pump was whining under the strain of keeping the heavy front axle pointed straight in the slick mud. The rain was coming down in blinding sheets now, the heavy-duty wiper blades thrashing furiously but barely clearing the glass. They were 4 miles up, 8 miles to go, and the worst was yet to come. Mile 7 of Ridgeback Pass was notorious in the county. It was a sharp, decreasing radius hairpin turn carved directly into the sheer rock face of the mountain. To the left was a solid wall of jagged granite. To the right was a 400-foot, near vertical drop into a rocky ravine. The locals called it Dead Man's Elbow. As Jolene piloted the W900 toward the turn, the storm intensified. Lightning spider-webbed across the purple sky, illuminating the canyon in strobes of harsh, blinding white. The rain had washed out the center of the road, leaving deep, treacherous gullies of running water. "Joe, listen to me," Bo radioed, his voice stripped of any casual demeanor. "The county guys on the dam just hailed me. The spillway is taking on water. You have 45 minutes before it crests. You have to push it." "I can't push it any harder, Bo. I'm redlining the thermal limits as it is." Jolene yelled back, tapping her pyrometer gauge. It was hovering dangerously close to 1200 degrees. The massive turbochargers under the hood were spinning so fast and getting so hot they were likely glowing cherry red. She downshifted again as the hairpin turn loomed out of the darkness. The headlights cut through the torrential rain, illuminating the slick, muddy curve. Because the lowboy trailer was so long, Jolene had to swing the cab of the truck perilously close to the granite wall on the left in order to give the trailer tires enough room to make the corner on the right. It was an agonizing geometry problem with 150,000 pounds of penalty for failure. She hugged the rock wall, the chrome mirror bracket scraping against the granite with a horrific screech, throwing sparks into the rain. She kept her eyes glued to her convex passenger side mirror, watching the massive trailer tires dragging through the mud, tracking closer and closer to the edge of the cliff. "Looking tight, Joe," Bo warned over the CB. "Swing wider. You gotta swing wider. I'm on the wall, Bo. I have no more room," she shouted. The front drive tires of the Kenworth cleared the apex of the turn. The transformer, towering high on the trailer, caused the center of gravity to shift violently as the trailer tilted into the rutted curve. Suddenly, the ground beneath the right rear axles of the trailer gave way. The heavy summer rains had eroded the shoulder of the road. A massive chunk of the cliff face simply sheared off, tumbling down into the black abyss below. Over the radio, Bo screamed, "Joe, trailer is off the edge. Hit the brakes." In the passenger mirror, Jolene watched in absolute horror as the back right corner of the lowboy dipped downward. The massive multi-axle assembly slid off the mud and into thin air. The trailer violently tilted 30 degrees to the right. The sheer physical weight of the 110,000-pound transformer suddenly pulling backward and downward slammed into the W900's fifth wheel like a freight train. The entire cab of the truck jerked violently to the right, lifting the front left steering tire completely off the ground. Jolene was thrown against the door, her seatbelt biting hard into her collarbone. Every instinct, every piece of modern driver's training, screamed at her to slam on the air brakes. It was human nature to try and stop the fall. But Jolene Higgins was raised by a man who understood the brutal, unforgiving physics of heavy iron. If she hit the brakes now, the momentum would stop. The dead weight of the hanging trailer would act as a massive pendulum, dragging the W900 backward, over the cliff, taking her with it. Traction is life. Forward momentum is your only god. Her father's words echoed in her ears. She didn't touch the brake. Instead, she jammed her boot down on the throttle pedal and pinned it to the floor. The Cummins N14 received a massive, unregulated dump of diesel fuel. The engine block shuddered violently, sounding like a string of dynamite detonating under the hood. The twin turbos spooled with a terrifying, ear-piercing shriek, stuffing compressed air into the cylinders. The three remaining sets of drive tires, still on solid ground, spun wildly in the mud for a fraction of a second before finding a ridge of buried bedrock. The W900 groaned. The heavy-duty U-joints in the drive shaft popped loudly, complaining under the impossible torque load. The front end of the truck remained suspended in the air, the massive steering axle dangling uselessly as the rear axles squatted down, taking the entire load of the sliding trailer. "Pull," Jolene screamed, gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white, fighting the violent shaking of the cab. "Come on, you ghost, pull." The engine roared, drowning out the thunder. The exhaust stacks shot a continuous column of fire and black smoke into the storm. For 5 agonizing seconds, the truck and the trailer hung suspended in a terrifying stalemate against gravity. The W900 was literally trying to drag 55 tons of steel deadweight up and over the lip of a cliff. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, the raw, unfiltered torque of the heavily modified N14 began to win. The W900 crept forward. The trailer frame dragged across the jagged edge of the road, peeling thick ribbons of steel off its underbelly with a horrific, screeching tear. But it was moving forward. With a final, violent lurch, the rear axles of the trailer bit into the solid mud on the road's surface. The trailer slammed back down onto all its wheels, and the front end of the W900 crashed heavily back to the earth, the suspension bottoming out with a spine-jarring thud. Jolene gasped for air, realizing she hadn't breathed in 30 seconds. Her hands were shaking violently. Bo's voice came over the radio, completely breathless. "Holy Mother of God. Joe, you pulled it back over. I thought you were gone." Jolene didn't reply. She couldn't. She just kept the pedal down, shifting up a gear as the road straightened out. They had survived Dead Man's Elbow, but the fight had taken a severe toll. Mile 10. The final stretch to the county reservoir was a brutal, unrelenting 2-mile straightaway pitched at an 18% grade. It was the mountain's final, desperate attempt to break the machines that dared to climb it. Inside the W900, things were going wrong. Fast. The violent stress of pulling the trailer back over the cliff had pushed the 30-year-old cooling system past its breaking point. A shrill, continuous warning buzzer suddenly erupted from behind the dashboard. Jolene's eyes snapped to the water temperature gauge. The needle was buried deep in the red zone, reading well over 230 degrees. The engine oil temperature was following closely behind. Warning. Engine temperature critical. A retrofitted digital voice module chirped over the sound of the roaring diesel. Shut up, Jolene hissed, scanning her gauges. If she was driving a modern truck like Blake Masterson's Peterbilt, the onboard computer would have already intervened. It would have registered the critical heat levels, thrown a code, and automatically initiated a derate-cutting engine power by 50% to protect the block from melting down. If the heat persisted, the computer would simply shut the engine off completely, leaving the truck stranded. But Old Blue didn't have an ECU programmed for safety. It had a mechanical throttle linkage and a fuel pump tuned by a stubborn old man. It would do exactly what Jolene told it to do, even if it meant destroying itself in the process. Bo. Jolene keyed the mic, her voice tight. She's overheating. Fast, I'm boiling coolant. Can you pull over? Let her idle and cool down? Bo asked frantically. If I pull over, I can't get started again. It's too steep, Jolene replied. She looked at the dashboard clock. They were out of time. The dam was minutes away from overtopping. I have to keep pushing. She reached for the climate controls. The only way to dump excess heat from the engine block without stopping was to open the secondary cooling loop, the heater core inside the cab. Jolene turned the cab heater on full blast and cranked the fan to maximum. Instantly, a wave of blistering, 200-degree air blasted from the dashboard vents directly into her face. The tiny, cramped cab of the W900 rapidly transformed into a rolling sauna. The smell of hot dust, boiling antifreeze, and burning oil filled the air. Within seconds, sweat was pouring down Jolene's face, stinging her eyes and soaking her heavy shirt. Breathing felt like inhaling the air from inside a pizza oven. Come on, Blue, she whispered, her voice cracking in the dry heat. Just 2 miles. Give me 2 miles, and I'll buy you all the fresh Rotella oil you can drink. Thump, thump, thump. The engine rhythm changed. It was a subtle skip, a heavy hesitation in the firing order. Jolene felt it in the floorboards before she heard it. She checked her mirrors. The steady stream of black exhaust smoke had turned into a terrifying, thick white cloud. She was blowing a head gasket. The immense cylinder pressure, combined with the extreme heat, was warping the massive iron cylinder head, allowing coolant to leak directly into the combustion chambers. The W900 violently shuddered, losing power. The RPMs dropped from 1600 to 1200. The truck slowed to a painful, crawling 1 mile per hour. Joe, you're blowing white smoke. You're gonna melt pistons, Bo yelled, flashing his high beams. I know, Jolene screamed, wiping the stinging sweat from her eyes. The heat in the cab was dizzying. Her vision began to blur at the edges. The oil pressure gauge began to bounce erratically. The engine was cannibalizing itself, grinding its own bearings to dust to keep pulling the massive weight behind it. Every mechanical instinct told Jolene to push the clutch in and save the engine. A rebuild would cost $20,000. If she threw a rod through the side of the block, the engine was scrap. But if she didn't get this transformer to the top, her farm was gone anyway. She reached forward and flipped a small, unmarked toggle switch hidden under the dash, the Pittsburgh Powerbox override. It bypassed the fuel pump's remaining governors, allowing maximum, unregulated fuel flow to the marine injectors. It was a death sentence for the motor. Jolene slammed her boot down, burying the throttle pedal into the rubber floor mat. The N14 let out a horrific, metallic shriek. The turbo whistle turned into a ragged, grinding howl. The truck surged forward violently, bucking against the immense weight of the transformer. Bang! A loud explosion under the hood made Jolene flinch. A coolant hose had blown off, spraying a geyser of boiling green antifreeze onto the glowing hot exhaust manifold. A massive cloud of foul-smelling steam erupted from under the W900's front fenders, completely blinding her. She was driving by instruments and pure memory, fighting the steering wheel as the dying engine hurled the rig up the final incline. The W900 was literally shaking itself to pieces, coughing, violently backfiring, and dragging itself up the mountain on pure, stubborn iron will. Through the thick, boiling steam and the heavy rain, a flash of red and blue light pierced the darkness. I see him, Joe, Bo yelled over the radio, his voice cracking with emotion. I see the dam. The crew is right there. You made it. Jolene kept her foot buried. The W900 crested the summit of Ridgeback Pass, rolling onto the flat, gravel plateau overlooking the massive concrete span of the dam. The emergency floodlights from the county crew's trucks illuminated the swirling steam pouring off Old Blue. A dozen men in yellow rain slickers ran toward her, waving frantically, directing her toward the crane staging area next to the spillway control house. Jolene pushed the clutch in and let the W900 roll to a stop perfectly aligned with the crane. She reached up and violently yanked the tractor and trailer air brake valves. Push, clack. The 150,000 pounds of steel finally came to rest. Jolene turned the ignition key off. The massive N14 engine shuddered, gave one final, exhausted cough, and died. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the hiss of boiling coolant escaping from under the hood and the roar of the rain. She sat there for a long moment, the blistering heat of the cab baking her. She rested her forehead against the hard plastic of the steering wheel. Her hands were cramped into claws. She had done it. Old Blue had done it. Through the rain-streaked window, she saw the county crane operator already hooking chains to the massive transformer. They had minutes to spare. Jolene pushed the heavy door open and practically fell out of the cab, her boots splashing into the deep mud of the plateau. The cool rain felt like heaven against her flushed, overheated skin. Sheriff Brody Miller, his uniform soaked through, ran up to her, shining a flashlight on the smoking, hissing ruin of the W900's engine bay. "Higgins," the sheriff breathed, looking from the rusted truck to Jolene, his eyes wide with utter disbelief. "They told me Masterson's $1 million rig got stuck in the mud at the bottom. They said you were coming up alone. I thought they were lying." Jolene leaned against the front fender of her truck, patting the faded blue fiberglass gently. It was blisteringly hot to the touch. "Blake Masterson drives a computer." "Sheriff," Jolene said, her voice hoarse, but a small, proud smile, finally breaking through her exhaustion. "I drive a Kenworth." The rain continued to hammer the concrete expanse of the county dam, but the frantic energy of the night had shifted. The deafening roar of the W900 had been replaced by the steady, industrial hum of the massive staging crane. Jolene Higgins stood ankle-deep in the mud, shivering violently as the adrenaline that had fueled her for the last hour finally began to evaporate. She leaned against the heavy steel bumper of Bo Dawson's F350, a thermal blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes, however, never left Old Blue. The 1995 Kenworth looked like a wounded soldier that had just dragged itself across a battlefield. The hood was tilted forward, exposing the massive, smoking ruin of the Cummins N14. The block was practically radiating heat, warping the heavy raindrops into steam the second they touched the iron. A dark, ugly puddle of mixed oil and green antifreeze was pooling under the oil pan, washing away in the heavy downpour. The smell of scorched metal, burnt clutch lining, and vaporized coolant was thick in the air. "She gave you everything she had, kid," Bo said softly, handing Jolene a thermos cup of lukewarm coffee. "I've been driving heavy haul for 40 years. I ain't never seen a rig take that kind of punishment and not throw a rod through the oil pan. That motor didn't just run, it fought." Jolene took the coffee, her hands still trembling too much to bring it to her lips. "I bypassed the governors, Bo. I pushed the exhaust gas temps past 1400. I think I cracked the head, maybe melted a piston on cylinder 6. It was missing hard at the top of the grade." Bo shined his heavy maglite onto the engine block. "You definitely blew the head gasket. Coolant pressure is 0. The turbo housing on the primary side looks warped from the heat, but the block looks intact. No holes. That old iron is thick." "Hey, Higgins," a voice barked through the rain. A man in a high-visibility slicker and a white hard hat was jogging toward them, sidestepping the massive, thick cables of the crane. It was Bill Denton, the Regional Emergency Management Director for the county. He looked exhausted, his face pale under the harsh floodlights, but his eyes were wide with relief. Behind him, the massive industrial transformer was being slowly lowered onto the concrete pad next to the spillway control house. The dam workers were already rushing forward with heavy-duty power cables, frantically hooking the unit into the grid. "You got 2 minutes to spare, Higgins," Bill Denton panted, coming to a halt in front of her. "The reservoir is half an inch from the parapet wall. If you had stopped to cool that engine, or if you had backed out when that trailer slipped, we would have lost the lower valley. 5,000 homes. The co-op. Everything." Jolene pulled the thermal blanket tighter. "Just doing the job, Bill." The contract was open. Denton shook his head in disbelief, looking at the steaming W900. "The state dispatch told me Blake Masterson was bringing this load up in a new flagship Peterbilt. When I saw this old farm truck come hauling over the crest, blowing fire and steam like a damned dragon, I thought I was hallucinating." "Masterson couldn't get traction in the mud," Jolene stated flatly. Computers don't know how to dig. Denton reached inside his slicker and pulled out a heavy, waterproof dispatch manifest clipboard. He clicked a pen, signing the bottom of the invoice with a flurry of quick strokes. He tore the top sheet off, along with a heavy, sealed manila envelope. The bounty was $30,000 for emergency heavy haul delivery, Denton said, handing the wet envelope to Jolene. Inside is a certified county emergency draft. You can deposit it right now digitally or hand it to any teller in the state. It clears instantly. It's FEMA back. Jolene took the envelope. It felt heavier than it looked. It was the weight of her father's legacy. It was the deed to her farm. There's something else, Denton added, lowering his voice slightly over the roar of the rain. I authorized an extreme risk hazard bonus from the county discretionary fund. An extra $10,000. That rig saved our hides tonight, Jolene. It's the least the county can do to help you rebuild that motor. Jolene's breath hitched. $40,000. It was enough to pay off the predatory balloon loan, cover the property taxes, and completely rebuild the N14 from the bare block up. Thank you, Bill, Jolene whispered, the fight finally leaving her voice, replaced by overwhelming gratitude. Don't thank me. Thank your dad for teaching you how to drive, Denton said, tipping his hard hat before turning and jogging back toward the spillway control room. Bo clapped Jolene on the shoulder. All right, kid. Let's get this old girl hooked up to the tow bar. I'll drag you back down the mountain. The storm is breaking. For the next hour, they worked in the fading rain. They disconnected the W900 from the empty lowboy, which the county would retrieve later, and hooked a heavy, rigid tow bar from the front of Jolene's Kenworth to the rear hitch of Bo's F350. Jolene climbed back into the cold, silent cab of Old Blue. Without the massive diesel engine thumping away, the truck felt entirely different. It felt like a tomb. But as Bo slowly pulled her back down the treacherous, muddy switchbacks of Ridgeback Pass, Jolene patted the dashboard. You did good, old girl, she whispered to the dark cab. You earned a rest. Dawn broke over the valley with a harsh, glaring clarity. The storm had washed the sky clean, leaving behind a brilliant, cloudless blue canopy. But the ground was a different story. The Miller Agricultural Co-op was a disaster zone of deep, thick, unyielding red clay. Jolene rode shotgun in Bo's pickup as they hauled the dead W900 into the co-op parking lot. The sun caught the faded blue paint of the Kenworth, highlighting the fresh scratches and the thick layer of baked-on mud caking its undercarriage. The lot was packed, but nobody was moving. As Bo parked his truck near the weigh-scales, Jolene stepped out and surveyed the scene. Blake Masterson's fleet of shiny 2024 Peterbilts were all parked in a chaotic, haphazard line. The drivers were standing around in groups, shouting into their cell phones and arguing with mechanics. Blake Masterson himself was standing near the office, screaming at a frazzled-looking mobile diesel technician who was plugged into the dashboard of one of the new trucks with a laptop. Next to Blake stood Victor Standish. Standish was the regional manager for the agricultural bank that held the note on Jolene's farm. He wore a crisp, tailored suit that looked entirely out of place in the mud, holding a leather briefcase tightly against his chest. He was supposed to be here at 8 a.m. to officially issue the foreclosure papers if the Higgins account didn't show the $30,000 balloon payment. Jolene took a deep breath, grabbed the manila envelope from her jacket pocket, and walked through the mud toward the office. The heavy boots of the gathered drivers parted for her, the silence rippling outward as they noticed the dead W900 sitting quietly on the tow hook. Well, Blake sneered as Jolene approached. He looked terrible. His designer clothes were spattered with mud, his hair was a mess, and his eyes were bloodshot from a night of humiliation. Look who got dragged back to civilization. I heard you blew your motor to pieces at the top of the hill, Higgins. That truck is finally the scrap metal I always said it was. Jolene ignored him, fixing her gaze entirely on the banker. Victor. You're early. Victor Standish cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. Miss Higgins, the deadline is at the opening of business today. Given your situation, and the fact that your only piece of capital equipment is currently non-operational, I brought the preliminary deed transfer paperwork. Mr. Masterson here has already made a very generous offer to absorb your acreage into his operation. Is that right? Jolene asked, her voice dangerously calm. She glanced at Blake. You trying to vulture my land before the body is even cold, Blake. It's just business, Joe. Blake laughed, though it sounded forced and brittle. Your truck is dead. Your farm is bankrupt. You can't even haul your own wheat out of the silos now. Sign the papers, take the pennies Victor is offering, and move to the city. This life isn't for you anymore. Jolene slowly opened the manila envelope. She pulled out the certified county emergency draft, printed on heavy, watermarked municipal paper. She held it up so the morning sun hit the bold black ink. Pay to the order of Jolene Higgins, Higgins Farms. Amount, $40,000, $40,000 and 0 cents. Memo. Emergency heavy haul and hazard operations. Ridgeback Dam. Victor Standish's jaw physically dropped. He blinked rapidly, stepping forward to peer at the draft. Is that a certified county bond? It cleared the digital deposit system 10 minutes ago via my phone. Victor, Jolene said, her voice echoing across the silent lot. The balloon payment is paid in full. The property taxes for the next 2 years are paid in full. The Higgins farm isn't going anywhere. You can take your foreclosure papers and use them to wipe your boots. A murmur of shock ran through the crowd of drivers. Kurt Willis and Chad Donahue stared at the check, their faces pale. Blake Masterson's face turned a violent shade of purple. That's impossible. That was my contract. You stole my haul. You got stuck in 2 inches of mud. Blake, Jolene shot back, her green eyes flashing with righteous anger. Your 500 horsepower plastic toy threw a transmission code and left the county to drown. Old Blue dragged that transformer up the mountain on a cracked head and 3 sets of drive tires. And now your truck is a giant, useless paperweight. Blake screamed, pointing at the W900. So what if you paid the bank? Harvest starts next week. You have no rig. You can't move your grain. You'll still go bankrupt by winter. Actually, Mr. Masterson, the mobile mechanic standing by Blake's truck suddenly spoke up, closing his laptop with a loud snap. I think you have a bigger problem than her. Blake whipped around. What are you talking about? Did you clear the codes? The mechanic sighed, shaking his head. I can't. The storm last night flooded the lower electronic control modules on 3 of your trucks when they were sitting in the deep puddles. The CAN bus network is completely fried. Furthermore, the humidity and mud tripped the defensive sensors on your DEF emissions systems. The computers think the trucks are heavily polluting, so they've initiated a hard lock derate. The engines won't rev past idle. So bypass it, Blake yelled. I can't, the mechanic replied, packing up his gear. It's hard-coded into the PACCAR factory software. It requires dealer-level flash drives to reset, and the dealership is backlogged for 3 weeks. Your fleet is grounded, Mr. Masterson. You can't pull a single trailer until mid-August. The silence in the co-op lot was absolute. The irony hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Blake Masterson, the man who had mocked the mechanical simplicity of the W900, was now entirely paralyzed by microchips and software glitches. He had a massive co-op contract to fulfill today, and no trucks to pull the grain. Jolene looked at Blake, all the anger washing out of her, replaced by a cold, hard pity. Looks like your computers couldn't handle a little bit of weather, Blake, Jolene said softly. She turned to walk back to Bo's truck. If you need someone to haul your grain next week, give me a call. But my rates just went up. The old Higgins barn hadn't seen this much activity since Roy Higgins was alive. For 3 solid weeks, the large, drafty structure was illuminated by the harsh glare of halogen work lights and the blue sparks of a welding torch. Jolene didn't hire a shop to rebuild the engine. She used the $10,000 hazard bonus to buy the parts, and she called in every favor her father had ever earned in the valley. Bo Dawson was there every night, covered in grease. Gary, a retired heavy-duty diesel machinist from the next town over, drove down to help sleeve the block. When they hoisted the massive iron cylinder head off the block with a chain block and tackle, the damage was terrifying. Cylinder number 6 had indeed suffered catastrophic heat damage. The piston was scored deep, and the head gasket was completely blown out, reduced to twisted ribbons of copper and steel. It's a miracle it didn't fuse to the cylinder wall, Gary muttered, inspecting the piston with a micrometer. She kept it fueled just enough to prevent a total lockup. They tore the Cummins N14 down to the bare block. They hot-tanked it, scrubbed the oil galleys, and began the meticulous process of rebuilding a legend. Jolene didn't just replace the parts. She upgraded them. She ordered a set of forged Marley Extreme duty pistons, capable of withstanding massive cylinder pressures. They sourced a brand new, reinforced Interstate McBee cylinder head that flowed 20% more air than the factory casting. The custom Borg-Warner twin turbos were sent to a specialist shop in Denver, where they were fitted with titanium compressor wheels and heavier thrust bearings to handle the extreme boost levels without warping. They installed massive, high-flow fuel lines, a heavier clutch assembly rated for over 3,000 foot-pounds of torque, and finally, they bolted on a fresh set of 8-inch, mirror-polished, straight pipes. It was grueling, knuckle-busting work. Jolene's hands were permanently stained black with grease. Her knuckles scraped raw from slipping wrenches. But with every bolt she torqued down, every gasket she seated, she felt the heavy burden of the last 2 years lifting from her shoulders. She wasn't just fixing a truck. She was rebuilding the heart of her family's livelihood. On the first Tuesday of August, the air in the valley was dry and smelled of ripe winter wheat. Harvest season had officially begun. The Higgins barn doors were wide open. Inside, Old Blue sat gleaming under the lights. Jolene hadn't painted the faded blue fiberglass. She considered the chalky, bruised paint to be a badge of honor, the scars of a truck that worked for a living. But the aluminum wheels had been acid-washed and polished until they looked like mirrors. The stainless steel bumper was straightened, and under the hood, the engine bay was a masterpiece of iron, braided steel, and high-heat ceramic coating. Jolene sat in the driver's seat. Bo, Gary, and a few other local farmers who had stopped by to watch stood around the front bumper, holding their breath. "All right, kid," Bo called out, stepping back. "Let's see if the ghost is still in there." Jolene pushed the heavy clutch in. She turned the key halfway, letting the electrical system arm. She waited for the fuel pump to prime, feeling the hum of pressure building in the lines. She twisted the key hard. The heavy-duty starter engaged. Rrr, clack. The N14 didn't hesitate. It fired instantly. Kaboom, toot, toot, toot. The barn shook violently as the massive iron engine roared to life. The exhaust note was deeper now, more resonant, vibrating in the chests of the men standing nearby. It was a perfectly timed, aggressive idle, free of any skips or hesitations. Jolene lightly tapped the throttle pedal. The response was instantaneous and terrifying. The RPMs snapped upward, and the twin titanium turbos spooled with a deafening, glass-shattering whistle that echoed out of the barn and rolled across the empty wheat fields. The sheer displacement of air blew the loose dust off the barn floor. Gary grinned, wiping grease off his hands with a rag. "Oh yeah, she's breathing fire now." Jolene backed the W900 out of the barn and into the bright summer sunlight. She hooked up to her polished grain hopper trailer, fully loaded with the first cut of the season's wheat. As she pulled onto the main county highway heading toward the Miller Co-op, she passed Blake Masterson's property. 3 of his expensive, aerodynamic Peterbilts were still sitting in his dirt lot, hoods open, waiting for back-ordered computer modules to arrive from the factory. Jolene reached up and grabbed the braided cord hanging above her head. She yanked it hard. The massive train horns mounted on the roof of the cab blasted a deep, echoing chord across the valley. She downshifted, the exhaust brakes barking loudly, and let the turbo whistle scream its high-pitched song of victory. She was a farmer, she was a gear jammer, and she was driving the baddest piece of iron on the mountain. They mocked the W900 for its faded paint, analog gauges, and mechanical simplicity. But when the computers failed and the mountain demanded raw power, it was the old iron that answered the call. Jolene Higgins proved that a machine built with purpose and driven with heart will always outlast shiny plastic and microchips. Old Blue wasn't just a truck. It was a testament to the stubborn, unyielding grit of the American independent farmer. The rusted Kenworth saved the valley, paid the mortgage, and silenced the corporate bullies who thought debt-financed chrome could replace hard-earned torque. Today, if you stand near the base of Ridgeback Pass during harvest season, you don't hear the quiet hum of automated fleets. You hear the deep, violent thumping of a legendary Cummins N14, and the unmistakable, triumphant whistle of a ghost that refuses to die.